With the release of the new Cold War Zombies map, Firebase Z, we got 2 additional support items, which are the Artillery Strike and the Napalm Strike. But not very many people are gonna care about those when they also decided to bring back the infamous perk from Black Ops 2 Zombies called Tombstone.
Rest in pieces, time for the count. No revival, you're bleeding out. Your epitaph says you died a wealthy man, but you can have it all, come back and see the master plan. Tombstone, it's Tombstone, it's Tombstone, it's Tombstone. Health is draining, you're on the roads. Death is waiting, don't lose your hopes. Your will and testament ain't making that much sense. This, that's the only answer, maybe quits. It's Tombstone, it's Tombstone, it's Tombstone, it's Tombstone. Tombstone.
Back in Black Ops 2, what Tombstone did was basically give you a chance to get your perks and your guns back after you bleed out in co-op. It was specifically designed for co-op. So if you had Tombstone, when you went down, you could hold X or square to die instead of getting revived. And when you spawned back in the next round, you could go to where you died, and there you could pick up a Tombstone power-up which gave you all your weapons and all your perks back. It was only on Transit and Town, and it wasn't available on solo. It was only in the map if you were playing co-op. Tombstone is one of those perks that sounds very interesting on paper, but when you actually use it, it seems kind of pointless. So let's say you go down, you have Tombstone, you decide to not let anybody revive you, instead you just activate Tombstone. And now you're just sitting there, spectating, and all of a sudden you come to the realization that first of all, you could have allowed yourself to get revived and kept all your guns, and you could just buy all your perks again, and you could have just kept playing instead of spectating. And as you're thinking about that, your friends who could have revived you are now about to go down, and they're not actually going to be able to finish the round. So now you have effectively ended the game, and then you realize that it could all have been avoided had Tombstone not existed in the first place. And that is why people didn't like Tombstone, because it's a perk that is more of a risk and reward gameplay mechanic, which is not usually a bad thing. But most of the perks up until that point didn't actually provide a downside. They all just gave you an advantage. So you always wanted to have as many perks as possible, and that's why there was a perk limit, to make you choose between the perks. And since Tombstone was pretty much the only perk that came with a potential disadvantage, it couldn't compete with other perks. It just didn't look good in comparison. I understand what Treyarch was going for with Tombstone. They wanted to stop the new players and the more casual players who are not very good at the game from being discouraged after going down, because the consequences of going down and bleeding out was just too much for most of the new players to handle, and they would sometimes quit the game, and it became a bit of a problem, especially in public matches. But if you were not a new player, if you knew what you were doing, chances are you probably stayed away from this perk in Black Ops 2. So when Treyarch announced that they were going to bring back Tombstone, I was very surprised because I didn't anticipate that they would choose Tombstone to be the first perk that they're going to give us. And then I read the description of the perk. It reads, when downed, become a shadow in the dark ether armed with your weapons that can revive you. If your shadow loses all its health, you die. Now that doesn't sound like Tombstone, which was an unpopular perk in an unpopular map, but it does sound ominously similar to another perk that was also an unpopular perk in an unpopular map. As a matter of fact, it's actually even more disliked than Tombstone. Some would say it's actually the worst perk ever, and by some, I mean pretty much everyone. Who's Who is a perk that was available in Die Rise in Black Ops 2, and here's what it does. When you have the perk and you go down, you will respawn as a doppelganger. You will only have the starting pistol, you will have no perks, and when you're in that state, if you somehow manage to revive yourself, it'll be as if you never went down in the first place. The only thing that's going to change is that obviously you're not going to have Who's Who because you used it. So you're going to keep all your perks and your guns. So technically, as long as you can utilize Who's Who, you can keep playing forever. But that's never the case, because Who's Who is another perk that sounds really good on paper, but it's really not. And here's why. When you're in this sort of afterlife mode and you're trying to revive yourself, you don't have anything. So it's going to be extremely difficult for you to revive yourself, especially in Black Ops 2 where you can only take 2 hits. And especially in Die Rise. This perk should not have been in Die Rise. It's especially bad in that map, because the whole map is constantly trying to kill you. That entire map is a giant health hazard. Not only are there tight corridors, but you're constantly in danger of fall damage. So it becomes really difficult to revive yourself. And not to mention, if you're playing in co-op and your doppelganger also goes down, the other players have to revive you and your doppelganger in order to revive you. Another big problem with Who's Who is that it overrides Quick Revive. So if you have Quick Revive and Who's Who, when you go down, Who's Who is going to be the perk that activates. And if you fail to revive yourself, you will die, even if you have Quick Revive, which is just horrible. You have a perk that makes another perk not work. And in Die Rise, if you can kill the jumping jacks without getting hit, you can get a free perk regardless of the perk limit. And if you get Who's Who, you're basically screwed, because the game doesn't give you an option to choose which perk you want to use. It just forces you to use Who's Who, which is the worst option. So again, this becomes another risk and reward kind of perk. If you're a really good player, then this perk is going to work for you. If you're anything but an elite zombies player, you probably hate it, and rightfully so. Who's Who was made in an effort to give us a better version of Tombstone, one that would work for solo players as well. It was supposed to be the improved version of Tombstone, but again, with the perk limit still being somewhat intact in Die Rise, it's just more practical and less risky to go with Quick Revive instead. If you had to choose between the two, Quick Revive seems like the better option. So Who's Who is another perk in Black Ops 2 that just wasn't able to compete with other perks. And now it's here in Cold War Zombies as Tombstone. The new Tombstone perk in Cold War Zombies is basically a combination of the old Tombstone and Who's Who, with some minor changes added to accommodate the style of gameplay in Cold War Zombies. For Tier 1, the description reads, Shadow form can regenerate health. For Tier 2, increase down duration to 60 seconds, and for Tier 3, on death, drop a Tombstone stash that saves your weapons, equipment, and resources. So the only thing that is actually Tombstone about this perk is unlocked at Tier 3. The rest is all Who's Who. And when you combine two terrible perks into one perk, the obvious question presents itself. Is this new Tombstone better or worse than its predecessors? And the answer is yes and no. It's different. They did improve on some things. They clearly looked closely at Who's Who and the old Tombstone, and they took all of the criticisms into consideration. But they also made a lot of mistakes, which ultimately results in this perk becoming a parody of its old self. But let's get into some details. So what's different? What has improved? Well, I'm gonna talk about the Tombstone side of this perk, and then we're gonna look at the Who's Who side of this perk, and we're gonna compare them to their old versions so you can see what's changed and improved, and then we're gonna look at the perk in its entirety and decide whether it's something you should go for every game. But before I do that, I have to mention this. If your expectations of this new Tombstone is that of something that is going to allow you to keep all of your perks after going down, you're gonna be very much disappointed. This is not a perk that is gonna allow you to keep all of your other perks. It just doesn't work that way, which is really weird because that was kind of the whole gimmick of Tombstone. In Black Ops 2 Zombies, Tombstone was known as the perk that you used so you could retain all of your other perks along with your weapons. Because of the addition of self-revive in Cold War Zombies, they had to design the perk in a way that works in tandem with the other gameplay mechanics in Cold War Zombies. So this is a very different perk. It's not the same thing it used to be. And with that out of the way, let's look at the Tombstone side of this perk, which is exclusive to co-op. If you go down in co-op and you bleed out, you will spawn in the next round, and the Tombstone stash will be exactly where you died. But the difference now is that it's not a power-up anymore. In Black Ops 2, it was in the form of a power-up, and it would go away after 90 seconds. But in Cold War Zombies, it doesn't disappear. It's not like a power-up, but it costs money. Depending on which round you're on, you're gonna be given a certain amount of points after you respawn, but you're only going to be given enough to buy your stash and nothing more. For example, I died on round 12 and I respawned back in on round 13, and I was given 12,000 points, and the cost of the stash was exactly 12,000 points. So there's no time limit, the Tombstone stash is not going to go away, but you will basically lose all of your points. You will not get any of your perks back, you will get your weapons back as well as your tactical and lethal equipment, along with any support items and also your salvage. So the Tombstone part of the perk is pretty bad, but I think they balanced it that way because it's combined with Who's Who. You don't get to just die, come back the next round, pick up your stash, and it'll be as if you never died. It's not like that, but that's because the game also gives you Who's Who, which gives you a chance to revive yourself and get most of your stuff back. So let's talk about the Who's Who portion of the perk. After you go down, you can do one of two things. You can either hold square to use your self-revive, or you can hold triangle to enter this shadow form, which is the same thing as the old Who's Who. But there are some changes that make it a little bit better. For example, in Black Ops 2, your doppelganger would only have the starting pistol and nothing else. But now, when you're in shadow form, you still have your guns and you retain your first 3 perks. So that's good and bad. They gave you something, but they took something else away. The fact that you get to keep your guns in shadow form is fantastic. It gives you a chance to survive. But if you revive yourself, you're still not gonna get all of your perks back, which kind of sucks. If you die in shadow form, you will die forever, which is something that hasn't really changed. In co-op, if you fail to revive yourself, you get to respawn and get all your weapons back. But that's not the case in solo, which is not a good thing. I'm not a big fan of the idea that some perks are worth more in co-op than in solo. The Who's Who side of the perk has some issues. In Cold War Zombies, when you go down, you keep your first 3 perks, but you lose the rest. When you're in the down state, if your friends take too long to revive you, those 3 perks get taken away from you one at a time. On solo, if for some reason you take too long to use your self-revive, the same thing happens. And that's because with the self-revive being in the game now, they want your death to have consequences, so that way going down feels like a real setback. But they also didn't want it to feel like too big of a setback that it makes you want to quit the game. So instead of losing all of your perks, you only lose some of your perks. And if your teammates take too long to revive you, then you're gonna lose all your perks. Now, this little gameplay mechanic that I explained has to work well with Tombstone in order for it to be a reliable perk. But it doesn't. When you go down and enter shadow form, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna lose the 3rd perk because you're not gonna be able to get back to your body on time. Most of the time, your shadow spawns in far away from your body. Sometimes it's not too far, sometimes it's really, really far, but most of the time it's far enough that you're gonna lose your 3rd perk. And if that perk is something that is essential to your survival, there's a very good chance that you might go down right after and lose your self-revive as well. For me, that has been the most frustrating thing about this perk. So I think that needs to be fixed. I think they need to make it so that your shadow spawns a little closer to your body so you can at least retain your first 3 perks. Because when you use your self-revive instead, you get to keep your first 3 perks. But with Tombstone, most of the time, you only get to keep 2, which is not good at all. And it sometimes results in unfair downs. Speaking of which, there's another problem with this perk. When you're in shadow form, even though you have guns and you have your 3 perks, you're still kind of vulnerable. You're on a time limit and you don't have any armor either. And in Firebase Z, after round 25, the map gets a little too hectic. You're gonna have to deal with mimics, manglers, and hellhounds in addition to dealing with zombies. And the mimics are especially too fast and too powerful, and their spawn rates are crazy high. And that also contributes to the previous problem we talked about, which is you not being able to get back to your body on time. And the mimics being running too fast and then being able to pull you towards themselves doesn't help at all. It wouldn't be as bad if there weren't so many of them in the map at the same time. So what happens sometimes is that you get to your body, you manage to revive yourself, and because the mimics and the zombies are right on your tail, you immediately go down again. And that is just not fair, because you spent your precious points on this perk for the purpose of saving your self-revive, and because of a simple design flaw, you end up losing your self-revive as well. Not to mention, you're gonna end up losing all your perks too, because you end up going down twice, and chances are you're not gonna be able to recover from that, so this perk could actually hurt you to the point that you lose a game that you wouldn't have otherwise lost. They need to make it so that the zombies ignore you for at least a couple of seconds after you get up, just so you can get yourself together and get out of that situation. There is no point in you busting your ass trying to get to your body to revive yourself if you're gonna go down immediately after. They need to either make the zombies ignore you for a few seconds, or maybe they could get stunned, or maybe reviving yourself can create a little explosion that knocks down the enemies so that way you still have the chance to get out of there. But they need to do something to fix this, because this is just bad. When it comes to how the perk functions in its entirety, if you're playing solo, it's basically who's who. You don't get to benefit from the tombstone part of it. In solo, all this perk is a resource management tool. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in this game, you have two types of currency. You have essence, or points, and you have salvage. Tombstone in Cold War Zombies is a way for you to trade your points for salvage. That's all this perk really is. It doesn't do anything that Self-Revive doesn't do. They do the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, Self-Revive is actually better because you don't put yourself at the risk of dying forever. When you go down, you can just hold square and get right back up. There is no shadow form, so there's no risk. And with Self-Revive, you actually get to keep your first 3 perks, but with Tombstone, you will most likely lose your third. Black Ops 2 Zombies gave us Who's Who in 2013, which was 8 years ago. And back then, the argument was that Quick Revive is better than Who's Who. And here we are, in Cold War Zombies, 8 years later, it's still more or less the same argument. Self-Revive is better than Tombstone, so that hasn't really changed. Back then, it was very high risk and high reward. It was very difficult to revive yourself with Who's Who, but if you managed to pull it off, it would be as if you never went down in the first place. Now, it's low risk and low reward. It's easier to revive yourself, but you don't get all of your perks back. You get a couple of perks back, and you get to keep your self-revive. All Tombstone does is allow you to keep your self-revive, which ultimately saves you some high-grade salvage. And that is pretty much where the entirety of its value lies. Keep in mind, self-revives are pretty expensive. 250 high-grade salvage is not nothing, and if you're someone who struggles with managing salvage, then you should probably get this perk. But if you're not, until they do some fine-tuning to make the perk a little more reliable, I would stay away from it, unless you're really confident that this perk is not going to screw you over. However, if you do run out of self-revives and salvage for some reason, then this perk suddenly becomes extremely valuable, because now it serves as an alternative to self-revive, which, when you think about it, is a pretty big deal. That is the only time when I would use Tombstone. If you don't have a self-revive and you don't have any more salvage, then Tombstone becomes an absolute necessity. Overall, Tombstone is not a great perk, but then again, we don't have a perk limit, and having more perks in the game doesn't hurt. But objectively looking at it, I wouldn't consider it a good perk at all. It needs some work. It needs to provide you with better advantages so that it's useful all the time, not just when you run out of salvage and self-revive. Right now, it's just a perk that is very one-dimensional and boring. It's supposed to be this last resort kind of perk that is supposed to help you recover from facing setbacks, but it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like it doesn't really belong. And I hope that Treyarch takes a good look at it and makes some changes so we can actually add another good perk to our arsenal. That is going to do it for today's video. Let me know in the comments section down below what you think of Tombstone and Cold War Zombies. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Rest in pieces.